A warm welcome, everyone, to today's webinar on patient engagement and medical devices, or patient engagement in the development and research and market launch of medical devices. We're looking forward to an exciting discussion today with a number of experts and also patients involved in this area, and with ample time and possibilities for you to join the discussion in the questions and answers sessions that we have inserted into this webinar. My name is Tamás Bereczky. I work with the European Patients Academy for Therapeutic Innovation, EUPATI. I have been engaged in content development and also as a trainer, and I will walk you through this or guide you through this webinar today. Before we get going, let me give you a couple of ground rules. Please remain muted during the webinar when you're not speaking. Of course, you're very welcome to speak in the questions and answers sessions. If you have a question that you would like to ask, or if there are any comments that you would like to make, please use the questions and answers box that you find in the control panel, where you can enter your questions and we get a notification, and then we can come up or come back to you with these questions and raise them to the panel participants. It's preferable if you use a headset, because that makes it easier and it cuts out the echo. Please mute yourselves. Please make sure that only one person speaks at a time. It's a little tricky with time management in case of an online session, so I will try to be strict with you all, with the panel and also with the other participants. Please make sure that your environment is silent and your phone is muted. We have a quite robust agenda, so this means that sometimes we will have to select and deselect questions. I cannot promise that we will have time to discuss and answer all the questions in detail. So our speakers today are Veerle Aertsen, who's a EUPATI fellow and who also will speak today about medical devices from the perspective of a patient. Inga Drossart, who's the Patient Engagement Officer at the European Society of Cardiology, and she will also import the patient's view in terms of medical devices and the cooperation of patients in the development of medical devices. Oliver Bisazza, who's the Regulations and Industrial Policy Director of MedTech Europe. MedTech Europe is the umbrella association of medical devices, industries, businesses in Europe. Piscoi, who's Scientific Policy Officer at the European Commission, and he works in the field of medical devices. Professor Fraser, who's the chairman of the Regulatory Affairs Committee at the European Society of Cardiology, and I will guide you through. I will be the moderator of this session today. So once again, if you have any questions, then please use the questions and answers box on your control panel. This is a quick recap on our agenda today. I will stop speaking in about 1 minute, and then we will hear 3 statements from our panelists. Then we have a questions and answers session for your questions, and also I will have some really basic groundwork questions for our panelists, then another two statements from 2 more panelists, and then again we will have a questions and answers session, and in the end I will try to give a summary of the takeaway messages of the sessions or of the session that we have today. This is also recorded, and the recording will be available for you in an edited and an easily digestible format on the EUPATI website and also on the Paradigm website. You are probably already familiar with what the Patient Engagement Open Forum is. It's a series of virtual events this year where we try to make sure that patient engagement is no longer just an aspiration, but it becomes reality. So we try to provide in this series of webinars and online meetings a holistic perspective of patient engagement and try to also foster and motivate for more collaboration and especially co-creation across all stakeholders participating in biomedical research and development in order to make sure that we come to better outcomes and to more meaningful science and, of course, also more meaningful engagement. And this cannot be possible without talking about medical technologies, medical devices as well, because that's also increasingly becoming an important part of what patient experts, patient advocates do and will have to do in the future increasingly. If you're interested in the detailed program of the Patient Engagement Forum, please go to this link on the website of either EPF or the Patient Engagement Forum or Paradigm or PFND, which are the co-organizers and the hosts of this series of events this year. So this is what we will talk about today. We will discuss the regulation of medical devices, also what is the role of patients in the regulatory environment, and we will hear about examples on patient engagement within medical devices. What we expect from this is to leverage knowledge and information about the current landscape of medical devices, how patients can be involved and are involved maybe already, how these proceedings can be translated into educational materials, which will then be hosted in the EUPATI toolbox and our learning platform or platforms. And also we would like to facilitate more and deeper dialogue across stakeholder groups. So with this, I would like to pass the floor to Paul Piscoi, who's the Scientific Policy Officer of the European Commission. Paul, you take it away and you speak about the regulatory framework and its benefits for patients.
Thank you, Tamás. Thank you for inviting us today here. I hope that the sound is working. So I work for the European Commission Medical Device Unit in DG Santé, and as I am the first one to speak, I have to let you know that our presentations will echo each other, and each speaker will explore in different depths, different concepts and different elements of the new regulation. So see the discussion today, or at least our presentations, as a flow. If you can go to the next slide. We are talking about the new medical devices legislation, but maybe we should start with the fact that we had for more than 20 years already a framework in place for medical devices, and we are transitioning from 3 directives to 2 regulations. And maybe the most important element of this is that the directives are more or less setting the general goals, while the member states, the competent authorities in each national state create the application rules, while the regulations are directly applicable, which means that we will have a higher harmonization of the rules across all Europe. The next slide. You have on the screen quite a complex diagram that will be easier to understand as the discussion progresses this afternoon. But what I wanted to put on the screen is a mix of governance and type of approval and verification, regulatory verification at the EU level. I choose to give you the most complicated and most stringent example, so you get an idea on how medical devices of high risk get on the market and what is the level of scrutiny. So the whole process starts with the manufacturer, which is doing the so-called preclinical testing, which is the initial laboratory testing, a proof of concepts. And if everything goes okay, a future medical device, the moment in development, is used on humans for a while, which is called clinical investigations, clinical studies. Then this will generate the real information on how a medical device behaves when used in human. Then this is all this information is gathered in something called technical file, and which also contains the clinical data, and is given to an independent verification body, which is called a notified body, who looks at the technical file and ascertains if the medical device is in compliance with the legal requirement. This is done, this notified body is under the scrutiny of a national regulatory agency, which is called the designating agency, a government body who is verifying that the notified body is apt to perform such verifications. And at a higher level, all the process is overseen by the European Commission, so that all the rules are applied uniformly throughout the Union. In certain cases, for the highest risk devices, a part of the conformity assessment, which is called clinical version assessment report, is sent for an independent scientific opinion, and this opinion is also put in the public domain. Now, if everything goes okay, the notified body issues a CE mark certificate, and this means the manufacturer is able to put the device on the market, sell the device, put it in use, and then it can be used in hospitals or directly by the general public. The process doesn't stop here, because the manufacturers has to continue to gather the data on how the device is behaving in real-world use, and this data is integrated then in the technical file, and conformity, basically conformity assessment in some of its aspects, is a continuous process. What's very important is that many bits of this process are now in the public domain or shared amongst the competent authorities. Next slide, please. So in this slide, I'm trying to outline the most important parts for the patients, and we will start with the fact that the new framework increases significantly the regulatory scrutiny. And one of the speakers that will follow me will explain these bits in more detail. Just to enumerate, we have enhanced requirements for clinical evidence, for the use of equivalence, for the post-market surveillance, which means what is happening with the device after it gets on the market and is scrutinized by the manufacturer. Post-market clinical follow-up, which is the clinical studies after the device gets on the market, vigilance, and market surveillance, which is the official control by the competent authorities, by the government. Interesting point, an important point, is the extension of coverage of potential liability, which is not now only for notified bodies, but also the manufacturers and authorized representatives, which means that they need to take sufficient insurance that in the unfortunate case when something goes wrong, the patient themselves will be compensated. Very important points on transparency and access to information. We have something which is called Summary of Safety and Clinical Performance, which will be put in the public domain and basically summarize all the data on the safety and on the performance of the device. Implant cards, the patients themselves will receive a card which will identify uniquely identify the implant and will give the most important safety information and the place where more information can be found. The clinical investigation report and its summary will be in public domain, so the data on the clinical data on how the device was tested before getting into the market will be public. The field safety corrective actions and field safety notice will be public documents. This is when something goes wrong and the manufacturer needs to bring corrections to the device, then those will be visible for everybody. There will be more information in the instructions for use, which are also accessible to the patients, and on the labeling of the device, which will be on the wrapping of the device itself. Furthermore, the devices themselves, the list of the device and their certificate and their manufacturers will be in the public domain. Now, where will all this information be found is on the second link on a database which is called EUDAMED. And furthermore, we have a wealth of information, including fact sheets for patients on our website, and this is the first link on the slide. And with this, I think my presentation is over.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was fascinating. Immediately getting into the depth of it. As you can see, this is a rather complex environment. So let's elaborate a bit on that. And with that, I would like to ask Oliver to talk about the perspective of an industry association. Oliver, you take it away.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to be here. So I hope you can hear and see me.
Absolutely.
And how do I control the slides? Will it be you, Tamás?
Yeah, that's me. So this is
okay.
Your first slide.
So I just have 3 slides basically to complement what Paul has already said. I think there are a couple of animations here. Tamás, you can click a few times, please. So as Paul said, we are talking about new regulations which replace existing legislation from the 1990s. And you can see from this slide the considerable extra detail that is now in these regulations. You know, the medical device regulation from 1990 and 1993 with only under 100 pages only, and we have nearly doubled that to 175. So the requirements, apart from being much more modern, robust, etc., are also much more explicit and detailed, which is hoped to result in much more harmonization across Europe of how we regulate the safety and performance of these important technologies. Next slide, please, Tamás. Some of the key areas in which the regulatory framework is being modernized and strengthened is on this slide here. For your reading material afterwards, we have some additional backup slides with details for all 4 of these topics, but the ones I would focus on today, similar to Paul, are clinical evidence, notified bodies, transparency, and in vitro diagnostics. In vitro diagnostics are a separate category of medical devices. They do not touch the patient, but they analyze samples from the human body, like saliva, blood, hair, etc., to aid a diagnosis. Very important, for instance, in times like an infectious disease pandemic. The regulatory framework for IVDs has undergone a real revolution, a big rewriting of the rule book, and it therefore has a slightly longer transition period than the medical devices one. But even in the medical devices legislation, we have a number of key respects in which the oversight of the technologies is increased. Indeed, as Paul said, the level of clinical evidence that manufacturers need to present to demonstrate that their device works safely and as intended, the bar has really gone up in that regard, and the assessment of that clinical evidence by notified bodies and others has also really been tightened up a lot. Paul also mentioned the independent verification bodies, the notified bodies who oversee industry's compliance with the new rules. The system has also been considerably tightened for them. It is now harder, shall I say, to pass muster and be a notified body in Europe for medical technologies. It is fully expected that we will have long-term fewer notified bodies, but hopefully the best in class who really do an extremely rigorous job. And another area is in the domain of transparency. I mean, the European patient advocacy associations were pretty engaged during the creation of these regulations, and one of patients' key pleas throughout that process was for more transparency. Transparency meaning more information about the devices that exist in Europe, for instance, in a future European database, but also more transparency about what exact evidence underpins the device? What can I see as a patient if I've been implanted, for instance, with something? How do I know what it is? What information the manufacturer has put on the table to show that it is safe? And this is provided in future innovative things like implant cards, which will become standard across Europe, and a document called the Summary of Safety and Clinical Performance. And so these are just some examples, not exhaustive of all, of how the framework has been really strengthened in the interests of patient safety and device performance. Next slide, please, Tamás, unless that's really, is that the last one? No, maybe the final one was just to say, so why was this overhaul needed? Why do we have such a tightening of the rules? Well, as I said, it was on the one hand to modernize the legislation. As I said, the regulations replace older directives from the 1990s, so a lot has changed in that time. We needed to, for instance, take account of technological developments like software, cybersecurity, and so on, and also to introduce a traceability system for devices on the market. So just modernizing the framework was one driver, but there were other key drivers, and let's face it, one of the key drivers as well was to increase public trust in the EU regulatory system. There had been concerns over the years that, following certain events, that the system was not sufficiently transparent and tight and needed to be strengthened, if you will, so that we can all credibly say that medical devices are subject to the state-of-the-art regulatory oversight that the public very legitimately expects. And the third and final consideration was about the notified body system. There was a real desire to ensure that notified bodies operate to the highest standards of competence, independence, and impartiality, and that we only keep the best notified bodies and get rid of the bad apples. And so these three things, I would say, are part of the reason why we have had this strengthening of the rules. And if you just click one more time, Tamás, I think we're at the end. We support all of this as industry. It costs money, it costs effort, it causes time, and it creates a bit of heartache. But at the end of the day, we fully support this desire to modernize our framework and restore trust in the system. And our members are investing heavily to get ready as best they can. And so thank you for your interest in this topic. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A. I think that was the end of my slides.
Thank you, Oliver. That was very interesting to see a little more detail, and the questions are already coming, so I take note of all of your questions, be assured, and we will come back to them in the Q&A session. But before that, I would like to give the floor to Inga Drossart, who speaks from the perspective of a patient who faces challenges with medical devices. Inga, you take it away.
Thanks a lot, Tamás. Thanks a lot for having me today. Very happy to be on this panel, and I hope everybody can hear and see me well. As Tamás mentioned, I'm speaking as a patient, and at the same time, I'm the patient engagement officer at the European Society of Cardiology. And as such, I'd like to start my presentation with giving you two examples of projects that have been done or are currently worked on in the European Society of Cardiology that are related to medical devices and where we are including patients. And the first example I picked because in these last couple of months, the topic of digital health has been one of the really hot topics during the COVID pandemic. And we've all seen that we really need these technologies to follow up on patients at home and avoiding clinic visits. And so at the moment, I'm involved in this position paper that's being developed and will be published in about a year. And it looks at the participatory co-design in digital health. And the reason for that is that a lot of these technologies, while the patient is often the kind of end user, a lot of these technologies are developed by companies with some researchers and healthcare professionals, but they often leave out the patients. And this results in a problem that these technologies are sometimes not adopted very well, or that they are soon abandoned because as a patient, I say, this really doesn't fit my needs and expectations. And so to improve this adaptation, it's important to involve patients right from the start, right from the beginning of the development of such technologies. And so what we are trying to do now is to give some recommendations as to how to set up a project on developing digital health technologies together with patients and how to include them right from the start. And yeah, I hope this will be ready in about a year. And the second example kind of relates to, next slide please, kind of relates to this first topic, because again, it looks at a digital solution, namely the remote monitoring of cardiac implanted electronic devices, which is, for example, the pacemaker I have. These devices, pacemakers, also defibrillators, nowadays can be remotely monitored. So you've got, as you see here on the infographic, a little monitor at home, usually next to your bed, and it regularly gets data from your implanted device and sends it to the physician. And the reason why we looked into this, so this was a task force at the ESC that just finished its work, and the reason why we looked into this was actually the entering into force of the new European General Data Protection Regulation, because as you can imagine, there is a lot of data, personal data, that's being transmitted and processed and analyzed in this process of remote monitoring. And what I, as a patient in the task force, specifically looked at was the informed consent that you get from patients who agree to being remotely monitored. And we compared a lot of different consent forms, which are usually provided by the different manufacturers. And we found out that with regards to the questions I've listed here, these forms vary greatly, and some are really barely readable for patients and very hard to understand, and they don't give you all the information you'd like to have. And again, the infographic gives you a good example for that, because here you get, as a patient, the impression that your data travels directly from your monitor to the physician, which is not the case. It goes to a cloud or to a server of the manufacturer first, and from there it can even be shared with third parties. So this is something every patient should be aware of and should know. And so we are working on, have worked on providing a kind of standardized consent form that covers all the important aspects, and that is better and easier to understand for patients. I'd now like to talk a little bit about my personal challenges as a patient living with a medical device, actually 2 devices. Next slide, please. And I've chosen to speak about a challenge I'm facing recently regarding my pacemaker and the remote monitoring that I've just mentioned. And the problem I faced here, the challenge I faced here, is that I wanted to have the remote monitoring function of my device activated. And the problem was that we couldn't do it. You have to, in order to activate it, you have to enroll the device with its number and everything in the online platform that the manufacturer provides. And my device was simply not listed there. And this was really strange. And so many emails and phone calls later, we found out that it's not listed because it is a device has market approval for Europe, so it's being sold and implanted in Europe, but the approval explicitly excludes the remote monitoring function of the device. So it has the function, but the function is not approved for use in the EU. In my case, it's only approved for the use in the USA. And this was quite a bummer. And for me, quite a shock, because as a patient, of course, I thought I have a device, I got a device that's fully functional. And even my physicians were not aware of the fact that you can get such a, I would say, partial approval for the market approval for a device. And so we now need to find a solution for that, and we're still working on it. But it is still quite a challenge, because I really need, it would be really good for me to have the function. And again, the COVID times have shown that it's sometimes necessary that you stay away rather from the clinic. Avoid going there for a checkup. So the remote monitoring would be very nice to have, especially in such times. As a conclusion from my experiences as a patient and as a patient engagement officer, I would say that the benefits of engaging patients on medical devices, research, development, and later on, is of course that you have the mutual learning. All of the involved parties, the companies, the healthcare professionals and patients can learn from each other. And it's especially a chance to better understand what matters really to the patients. What risks are they willing to take? How far do they want to go? What are they willing to tolerate? And it allows to develop medical devices that are kind of patient or consumer centered in their design. And this makes it easier, of course, for patients to accept the devices, to adhere to them. And this is also true for medical trials and recruitment of patients to medical trials and later the market approval, because if you have a device that it doesn't really fit patients' needs, you will not be able to get a lot of patients into the trials. But there's also challenges, and I have faced these challenges, for instance, in the task force on the remote monitoring, because these are highly technological devices. It's a very complex regulatory framework, and you really have to become kind of an expert as a patient to understand everything and to bring in your perspective. And moreover, and these are challenges that you have probably in every project that involves patients, you have to make sure that the patients you involve are in a way representative, that, for instance, I'm 38. If you only ask a patient like me, you might miss the different perspective of a patient who's 70 or 80. And last but not least, it's not really a challenge, I would say, but something you have to keep in mind in the whole process. You have to accommodate to patients' needs, which can, for instance, mean if you work with a heart failure patient, that you cannot have a workshop from 9 till 5 because it's just too long and it's just too exhausting for the patients. I think that's it for me for now, and happy to hear the questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Inga. That was very interesting, and once again, it points to the tremendous complexity of this field. And we have a number of questions. So I would like to ask all of you, the entire panel, also Ellen and Veerle, who have not spoken yet, to chime in if they want or can in terms of answering these questions. So the first one I have here, if you can quickly tell us what is going to happen with the UK and the regulatory environment in the UK when the UK leaves the EU. Maybe that's for you, Paul.
Thank you, Tamás. I don't believe we still have finished the discussions with UK. We don't even know exactly what the withdrawal agreement, the shape of the withdrawal agreement will take. So at the moment, we don't yet have something to share. It will probably be a bilateral agreement like the one we have with Switzerland and with Australia and with the US and even Turkey. If UK will keep on having the same type of regulatory approach, which is the user notified bodies, or if they will go more towards the US model, which is central agency approving market access, which is one of the possibilities, we don't know yet. So that's everything I can share with you at the moment.
Great, thank you very much. It's still an answer, so we don't know at this point. Now, the next question is, if a company gets a CE marking, and does that mean that the product is allowed to be sold in all EU countries, or do the national organizations, the national notified bodies, have the last say?
Maybe also for me, the answer is yes. There are nonetheless some possibilities for national competent authorities to take different decisions in case there is a risk which they believe not to be completely controlled, but this needs to be notified to all the other member states, and usually are only temporary measures. And in terms of the classification of the product, usually, so this is the class risk. Usually, still the competent authorities have a bit of leeway, so they can decide that in their territory they accept the same device as a lower or higher risk class. But generally, the answer is yes. If a product is CE marked, it has free access all over the Europe. And furthermore, there are third countries accepting CE marking. For instance, Australia is directly allowing products CE marked. Also, South Korea, India, and all the countries in the EEA space, which is Iceland, Switzerland, Norway, and Liechtenstein.
Oh, but this actually leads us on to the next question from the audience, which concerns medical devices coming from outside the EU, and the example of China is mentioned here. Will there be a central repository or a list or a register of devices that have a legitimate CE marking? To guarantee that their safety checking and efficacy checking has been done? Will this be an open, a public database, so that European manufacturers who comply with all the rules can actually compete on an equal basis? Maybe, Oliver, this is for you.
Sure, I can offer an answer. So when it is ready, the future EUPATI database, which I understand is currently foreseen to go live in a couple of years from now, will indeed render more publicly available, or at least in a central location, the information about the devices which are on the market. And for each device, it will specify who is the manufacturer, and so you will know what country that manufacturer is in, including if it is outside the European Union.
Okay, and actually, again, following up on this, one member of the audience says that, Paul, you mentioned that there will be more information available in the public domain. However, the question is, will this be in an easy to understand lay language? Will there be lay language summaries? Will it be free of jargon? And how will the patients and the public be involved, if at all, in constructing these product summaries? Maybe this is for Oliver, you as well. I'm not sure who of you can answer this.
Paul, would you like to go first?
Okay, I'll give it a try. There are two sources of information or rather, three or four even. The main important ones for high-risk devices, sources of information in lay language would be the summary of safety and performance for the device, which for high-risk devices also will have a section to be easily understood by the patients and not only by clinicians. The second source of information in lay terms would be the summary of clinical investigation. This is only for class 3 and implantable devices. The fourth source of information, it's instructions for use. Usually those should be made available by the clinicians to the patients by default, but maybe not all clinicians are doing that, so the patient should know that they have the right to ask for them, and all the information they need should be also in there. And maybe the last important one is the implant card, where the information will be for the patient, including elements of safety and precautions that the patient needs to take. Maybe Oliver, if you want to complement this.
I think that's a very good and complete answer. I mean, it's clearly not all of the regulatory documentation underpinning a device will be written in a lay person friendly format. Some of it is specifically intended for the physician or for the notified body or the regulator. But as Paul has said, there are a number of specific documents which for the first time must be understandable to laypersons or the patient, especially if it's a device intended for direct use by the patient, you know. So if you have your own, I don't know, insulin pump or something like that, you are partially the user. It's not just for use by a professional, and therefore the instructions and some other things need to be understandable to you. Yeah.
Tamás, this is Alan. Could I add one thing to that answer?
Absolutely, yes, please.
Just briefly, that it perhaps would be helpful to know that the summary of safety and clinical performance with the shorter version in language that is easy for patients to understand has to be made available by the manufacturer in a version in each language for each country where the device is on the market and sold. So every patient in Europe should have access to this information in their own mother tongue.
Okay, makes sense. We have more questions, so why don't we just carry on as long as we still have quite some time. The next one is, because there are differences in GDPR and in how GDPR is applied in different countries, how does the regulation or the regulations deal with the difference in privacy rules across the countries?
Perhaps I could start that if no one else is offering.
Absolutely.
For the document that Inga mentioned about implantable electronic devices, we took legal advice about the implications of the data protection regulation for health. And it is a European Union regulation, which means that it is adopted and incorporated into the national law of each country without any change. So the questioner says that there is a difference, but in fact the legislation should be the same throughout Europe. And if there are any differences in how it's interpreted, then there is the possibility to get legal advice about that through the Office of the European Data Protection Supervisor. And it is an issue with the use of health data currently, how much these can be shared and how much they are similar in each country. And the Data Protection Supervisor is currently working to produce more specific guidance for physicians and researchers and manufacturers and patients on how this will apply in detail. So I would say that it should be the same, but the details are still being developed. That's the end of my answer.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm not a data privacy lawyer, but I'm inclined to agree with Alan. I think the General Data Protection Regulation is meant to greatly harmonize the rules in this area. It's fairly new. I think it only came in a year or so ago, but indeed it replaces older legislation where you had quite fragmented approaches between the countries, as what I hear. So indeed, some of those concerns may very well have been real in the past. They should be going away now if the GDPR is working as intended. So important to monitor if that's not the case. No.
All right. So this also actually opens.
Maybe to try to end the answer, GDPR is not one of the focuses of my work, so I don't know a lot, and it's not quite clear what type of private data the question refers to. But usually when we use data sets for assessment of the safety of the devices, usually they are anonymized. So not even the regulators at EU level see what is the content. And for the all content of EUDAMED, data protection is applicable. So it is that the information on individual data either doesn't make it to EUDAMED, or it's only available to very strict categories of staff, and that mostly means the regulators themselves. So such information will not be in the public domain. If there is more detail on the question, maybe we can try to elaborate. If not, I think this would be the answer.
Excellent. What I wanted to add here is that probably this is exactly one of the areas where patients and patient organizations can make meaningful input into what is happening in the regulatory environment and how that then is applied in practice. We still have a number of questions, 4 that we could and should discuss, but I would say that we postpone that for the questions and answers session after the next part of the panel. And I would like to ask Veerle to once again come in with the patient's perspective and talk about her experience and her impressions. And then we will listen to Alan, and then we will recap on the questions again. Please type your questions into the questions and answer box. I see one person who raised their hand. Maybe that was just a mistake. I would like to carry on with the panel now, so please enter your question into the question box. Thank you. Veerle, you take it away.
Okay, thank you, Tamás. Hi, all. Most of us present here and a bit aware of patient engagement probably have come across my first slide, which is a familiar one, on patient engagement and its potential to involve patients in the research and development life cycle of medicines. As EUPATI fellow and engaged patient, I know that even in the neurodegenerative disease area, it is becoming, often more slowly than in other disease areas, standard to include patients. The entire sector of medical devices is far less regulated, and safety of the patient, as past and personal experience have shown, have not always been a top priority. Before my DBS, the brain simulator, I Googled online and found studies proving that as much as 92% of people who went through the same procedure as I had to deal with speech impairment. It's often easily dismissed as being the natural development of the disease, but thanks to my network on social media, I actually got to know a patient who can speak only when he turns off his device. Problem with my device is that the revenue model for hospitals is going to only the surgery department, and the aftercare, the most important for the patient, seems to be no one's responsibility anymore. Which is a shame, because when everything is done properly, I would say a DBS can be considered a disease-modifying therapy for people with advanced Parkinson's like me. So for those who, second slide please, Tamás. So for those who don't know me, my name is Veerle Aertsen. I'm 48 years old and I'm a mom of 4. And before my medical journey, so to speak, began, I was working as an HR consultant at Drossart. Around 2005, a year after the birth of my youngest son, I started to experience serious pains in my lower back. But as I was rather active, I wanted to get it over and done with. Had an herniectomy and consequently a lumbar disc replacement. The journey ended when, at the age of 38, I was told I had Parkinson's and sent home with prescription for meds. As it goes, I gradually took more meds. It was really hit and miss and trial and error. But by 2016, I was totally dysfunctional on maximum dose of L-DOPA, our golden standard. I just about managed to finish my EUPATI course and continued my volunteering as I had become quite active on the advocacy field, as I felt the way I was treated was not really correct. But I'm not here to talk about that. I was referred to Leuven and my neurosurgeon took all the time to explain and settle my worries, which were numerous, as already the sound of a dentist drill makes me totally freak out, let alone the sound of a drill to make holes in my skull, as you have to be conscious during the entire procedure. To cut a long story short, it proved a life-changing experience. My neurosurgeon is one of the best in Belgium, as very meticulous as I came to learn. It's not always the case. So there and then, 5th of May 2017, my journey as a young onset Parkinson's disease patient with a DBS starts. I've tried to convey my experiences in various settings, and last year contributed as a patient representative to an EIT health-funded project called DBS Select in Health House Leuven. I was part of their advisory board and interviewed on my experience living with the brain simulator, so other patients who are now considering doing the operation can go and have a real artificial intelligence experience of the procedure and watch testimonials of various patients. So, about patient involvement in medical devices. What are the challenges and the opportunities? Slide 3, please. So, in medical devices, the patient is often not part of the development team. This leads to problems for patients using medication and leads to non-adherence. This example of good practice comes from my Dutch EUPATI colleague Dominique Hamerling, who works for the European Lung Foundation. On this slide, we see a spacer, aid for patients with not enough strength to inhale the medication. The medication is mixed with air and thus easier inhaled. But as you can see on the picture, the first examples were very big and the plastic was very brittle, which caused problems as the patients need the meds a few times a day, so it needs to be carried along to work, school, etc. Insurance also only refund one device a year. On the second picture is the more recent version co-designed with patients. So slide 4. On slide 4, you see the manual of my patient programming device, which I can use to adjust the setting of my device myself. The booklet itself contains 512 pages and is printed in 3 official Belgian languages. The device itself you can best compare to a TV remote. The only downside is you need to take out the battery at the backside, because as you can't switch the remote on or off, batteries die within a week if you would keep the device on. Taking out the batteries every time I use it is not really user-friendly for patients with impaired fine motor skills. I've tried to get in touch, as I would like to see a more user-friendly booklet with more relevant information for the patient, which now often goes missing. Like my personal experience with the information on slide 5, please, Tamás. As I'm a Parkinson patient, it is extremely important to exercise intensively. Luckily enough, I live only 12 kilometers from a neuro-revalidation center where I can go and practice 3 times a week. They also have a pool for hydrotherapy, and as I had managed to get my back back into shape after my implant by a regular swimming session, after my DBS operation and the realization I had hardly any muscles left, I thought that would be a brilliant idea. So prior to leaving to Greece for my summer holiday that year, I jumped into the pool to find myself having to be rescued by my physiotherapist, as it appeared the difference in current between the right and left side in my brain had made me lose my ability to swim. Luckily, through intensive practice and a more balanced current, I'm now safe again to swim in an open sea. But every once in a while, I still post a study on the different social media groups to alert fellow DBS patients of my experience. And last month, I heard that the manufacturer in Holland at the University Hospital of Amsterdam have alerted their patients by mail. I can only hope that apart from these 2 efforts, all manufacturers do the same in all the countries in which their device is used. So I would like to end with the last slide. We patients are the most underused stakeholders in this entire value chain of healthcare nowadays. With resources getting scarcer, it shouldn't have to be. The experience we bring to the table should be better validated. With more than 50,000 medical devices going from the staple used to stitch patients all the way through to high-tech devices that impact patients' daily life functioning, we ought to have our experience better listened to. I'm not an academic nor a neurosurgeon scientist, not a customer of healthcare products. I'm a patient trying to convey the positive and negative experience into a positive narrative for all my peers. We are here willing to learn to help disseminate. Interact with us and don't hide behind the wall of compliance. We can still talk, think, reflect on how to improve things. So reflect for a minute on my last quote expressed by the director of the VB, Caroline Powles, on a program about big data and artificial intelligence. Because knowledge is power. It is not because something is technically possible. It is socially desirable, legally permissible, economically viable, and ethically responsible. Quite often, it's only economically viable if it is sold on a large scale, which without, again, postponed new MDR and without patients involved is, in my humble opinion, not ethically responsible. Nothing about us without us. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Veerle, and I'm happy that you brought up this this last important point about nothing about us without us, which we keep repeating every single time when it comes to patient engagement. I can see that there have been some additional questions coming up, so we will follow up on those. And before we get there, I would like to ask Professor Alan Fraser to bring in his view from a professional and academic viewpoint. Alan, you're a practicing clinician, and also you do a lot of policy work and thinking. So you take it away.
Are you going to share the screen, or do you want to show my slides, Tamás?
I'm sharing my screen, I believe.
All right. Thank you very much. As you've just said, I chair 2 committees on regulatory affairs, both within cardiology, which is my own subspecialty, and within the Biomedical Alliance, which is an umbrella organization for 33 different medical specialties across Europe. So I have now the opportunity to interact with colleagues from many disciplines to try to understand what the most important issues are. And the next slide, please, Tamás. And when we started to get engaged as physicians, the regulatory environment in Europe seemed to be a dialogue between the regulators and the European Commission and the manufacturers. And indeed, that's how medical device regulations started to develop 30 years ago as both of those. If you advance, just click once, you'll see that what we have been aiming to do is to include academia in a tripartite discussion, because we think it's essential that regulatory science and evidence guides the approval and system for getting new, particularly high-risk devices onto the market. And that involves expert clinicians in each field, scientists and engineers who develop the devices, and we can do this collectively through medical associations. And we always thought that we also could represent patients, and after all, each physician will see many patients, whereas one patient as an advocate may have their own experience, but may not have the width of experience of all other patients with the same condition. If you click once more, please, Tamás. However, I think we now realize through all the different interactions that we've had and through presentations, which I've been that expert patient can be hugely helpful. And we've just heard 2 such presentations, and I completely agree with that. If we go to the next slide, you should see a timeline from the European Medicines Agency. And since it was formed in 1995, they have been actively engaging with patients. So you will see on the right all the different ways in which that happens now, both at the level of policy at the management board, through specific scientific committees, down to reviewing written material and preparing guidelines. If you move to the next slide, you will see that when the new regulation comes into place in Europe in 1 year's time from now, there will be scientific expert panels providing an independent opinion to the notified bodies and the regulators about the standard of evidence and whether or not the evaluation by the notified body is appropriate. And for us, this is a huge advance. This will be the first time after 30 years of European regulations that at the EU level, scientific experts will be involved in the system. And you'll see on this slide the evidence that we submitted to the Joint Research Centre of the European Union, who've been developing this new system. And we proposed, just like the European Medicines Agency, that members of the public and patients or users should be included in these expert panels. But that has not happened because it was not part of the regulation. Next slide, please. Instead, let's think about how patients can help, particularly to evaluate devices. And this slide summarizes a report from the Medical Device Innovation Consortium, which is a private-public partnership in the USA that includes representatives from the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, the American Regulatory Agency. And they have proposed this thematic framework, which I think is very helpful. Any new device is approved because its benefit outweighs its risks. And if you look at the top left of this diagram where it's green, you can see a device with a very large benefit and a very low risk. That's uncontroversial. Everyone would approve of that being available as widely as possible for patients who need that device. And in such a context, there's probably little more that patients need to add. But for all the other three groups, particularly if you look at the top right, where the benefit may be large, but the risks are also significant, then it's an issue for the individual patient if they want those benefits while accepting the risks. And for that and the other two lesser categories, I actually think it's very important that we integrate opinion from many patients into this process. Now, I could go through examples of each of these categories, but we don't have time to do that. So if we could move to the next slide, I'd like to echo the theme that Inga Drossart picked up on one particular area of developing technology in medicine, and that is how we monitor patients and acquire information. And this slide just summarizes from a recent paper, new wearable devices, internet-enabled technology, and you can see on the left a whole range of things that they can monitor, from the heart rate and rhythm to blood pressure, fitness activity, breathing, temperature, oxygen levels in the body, and so on. And on the right and in the diagram, the types of devices at the top, spectacles or eyeglasses, in the middle a patch on the patient which can do all sorts of things, and then either a smartphone or a wearable device on the wrist. All of these are now generating a huge amount of data. Those that are medical devices rather than just health apps will be evaluated. They're usually not high risk, but some of them might be high risk if they were guiding decisions with very important consequences for the patient. The next slide shows a different way of monitoring, and this refers to the study that Inga mentioned, which is looking at implantable devices. And for the heart, we can use these both to monitor the patient, but also to treat them with pacemaking, with defibrillation, with monitoring pressure in arteries, and all sorts of different things. And these are now remotely monitored and internet enabled, as you have heard. And for me, from a clinical perspective, I found it extremely valuable to have the patient's voice in our task force, and for us also to consult with patients, particularly about the use of the informed consent form so that it's not too complex and that evidence and information is given to patients in format that is suitable for them. I think that's crucial. And we still have a lot to learn there, not just in cardiology, but in other fields. The next slide, please, Tamás, shows how all this information is now coming together into the big data environment. From the top left, we monitor patients' outcomes with patient-reported outcome measures used in all medical specialties and with thousands of medical publications in the literature. On the bottom right, the types of devices that you can wear or that might be implanted, all providing data. And then if you combine those with the electronic health record, the patient's clinical records at the bottom left, and with other information such as the top right, pharmacy prescriptions for drugs, and ultimately national databases of deaths, we have a very, very powerful tool for research coupled with machine learning and artificial intelligence to generate data. And this is advancing very fast, but with still many issues to be resolved. And I completely agree with a comment that Tamás made earlier, that the patient's voice here is going to be extremely important. And what we really need is research that will show how all these developments can improve outcomes for patients. We have to put that first when we consider the new technology. Now, if you could go to my last slide, which looks relatively complicated, I'll just take a couple of moments to go through this. I don't think the question is, should patients contribute? I think they must, and what I've tried to summarize here is how, from my clinical perspective, I think patients can contribute usefully, indeed essentially, to the evaluation of medical devices in Europe. If you look across the middle of the slide, you will see part of the slide that Paul Piscoi showed at the beginning, which is the process of approval of a device from the manufacturer, collecting evidence, the conformity assessment by the notified body, which is the key step, and then monitoring of the performance of the device afterwards. Now, the European Union regulation on medical devices does not envisage any role for patients directly in the conformity assessment or the clinical scientific evidence being provided by an expert panel. So here the role is for the European Patients Forum and patients' representatives as stakeholder members of the committees at the European Commission and working with the national regulatory agencies to develop appropriate policies, and they can be very effective, and indeed their voice is heard and listened to. So with that exception, at every other stage, I think patients have a great role to play, starting from the top left in helping us to know what's really important for patients. A lot of new medical devices come from technological advances, and I would like to see more starting with patients or physicians identifying for the innovators what we really need. Then when we do clinical investigations, I think patients should help with designing the ethical approval processes, with monitoring the information and the informed consent, and also identifying what endpoints should be important to patients to decide whether or not a device is going to be useful. Then after the device has been approved, market access, of course, depends in each country on health technology assessment that certainly for the time being is not conducted jointly at a European level, or very little. And here there is an important role for patients to ensure that effective devices become available within each country. And then lastly, monitoring and surveillance is extremely important. I think it was through registry data and information provided by patients, for example, that problems with metal-on-metal hip replacements and with surgical meshes first became really obvious. So patients need to help with monitoring the performance of their devices. They should report any experiences that can be helpful to give early warning of potential problems, or indeed feedback if the device is working extremely well. And now patients' data is being collected in registries of device performance. We would like patients to give permission for that data to be shared with other patients' data, even from other countries, to give us much earlier signals of how devices are performing. And lastly, both for the clinical studies and for the monitoring, patient-reported outcome measures, or PROMs, are going to be even more important. As I've already said, that's an active field of research. There are standards being developed, and again, patients have been contributing hugely to all those initiatives. So in my clinical opinion, I've changed my mind, as I hope I've implied, and I really do see the benefit of patients contributing actively to this process. And I'll be very happy to join the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. That was absolutely brilliant, because you've already pointed to a number of milestones in the development process and in the market launch process, where patients can and should be involved. And also, this is very much in sync with what's happening in the medicines field, so with pharmaceuticals. And our ultimate objective would be to understand how that model that we've already developed within EUPATI for patient engagement in medicines development, how that can be then eventually translated to medical devices as well. I would like to carry on then with the questions. There's a few more that came in while you two were speaking. So if you don't mind, I would kick off with the first one, which says whether you can perhaps comment on the awareness amongst patient entrepreneurs and the need for regulatory review when they create their own devices. And I think that this also may refer to the current trend that we will find with biohacking. Will they understand what needs to be done? Because after all, points out someone from the audience, coding is already taught in primary school these days. What's your take on that? And the question goes to everyone, of course.
I hear a lot of silence. Let me start. I suspect that patients who are developing their own devices will know very little about the regulatory framework. But I doubt if that's very different from a lot of physicians and surgeons, doctors, who also have an idea for a new device, and they start to get involved in developing it, working out prototypes. And they also don't know how important it is that they collect evidence to prove that it's safe and that it's effective. And we need to remember that there are many ideas that don't come to a market product, and many ideas that fail to be developed for all sorts of different reasons. And just because someone has an idea that they think is going to be helpful does not necessarily mean that it will work for everyone. And so we have to operate within an environment where things are done in a logical fashion and data are collected very carefully, and that we prove that devices work before they go on the market. Indeed, myself and colleagues, we got involved in this field because we saw devices on the market for which there were clinical problems. And so we want to help to promote higher standards and more evidence. So I think patients should be trying to understand what happens, and they should be working with other people who can advise them how this is done most appropriately.
Right, thank you. Any other takes on this, perhaps from Oliver? Is the industry monitoring such efforts by patient communities at all?
So this is about patients who make their own devices, basically. Did
Yes,
I get that
exactly.
right, Tamás?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So from the perspective of European Union regulation, this is a little bit something they are quite silent on. I mean, the scope of the EU legislation is for those devices which are going to circulate on the market, right? So you want to not so much develop it for yourself, but to make it available European-wide. And that's the kinds of devices where European regulation kicks in. And for that reason, you won't find anything in the regulations, to my knowledge, which explicitly prohibits, allows, or says anything else about these. This is not to say it's an unregulated space, but it's perhaps outside the competence of the EU medical devices regulations. That's all I would really have to say about that. So it seems to be something the EU legislation is neutral on. No.
Oliver, I agree with what you've just said, but I interpreted the question as meaning a patient develops a device that they want to make available to other people with the same condition, rather than just to use for themselves.
Right. So indeed, in that case, I mean, if the idea is for the device to actually circulate commercially, certainly European-wide, then whether you're an individual or a large multinational corporation, you risk to become the manufacturer and needing to comply with the regulation. It might be a little bit different if you are only going to circulate the device at national level. I must confess it could be possible that can be done according to national rules. Paul might know this better than I. But indeed, if you are going to make it available to others, shall we say, then you should probably ensure that the device is as safe and performs as any other device that would comply with the regulations. And it's well, you saw the number of pages in that regulation. It's not something you can get your head around in an afternoon. So,
right.
If I may try to complement Paul here,
yes.
It's a bit of an unusual question. So if somebody develops something, a technology for his or her own use, I don't even think we would qualify this as a medical device as per regulations. That would be unregulated. Which is similar to the use of a surgeon, for instance, of a device outside its indications for use. That's an off-label use. Can happen, it's not regulated, and it's completely under the responsibility of the surgeons. everybody knows that this is a current practice. It is happening, but it's not covered by the legislation. Now, I have heard an interesting story about a group of parents from MIT who had children with diabetes, and what they did, they hacked the code for an insulin pump, implantable insulin pump, and an implantable glucose meter, and they made the two. They were able to program the two so that they communicate, so the child gets continuous infusion of insulin by the time when they need. They went even further. They made available this code on their on a website when they run into significant troubles with FDA. Which FDA saw them as manufacturers of medical devices, and of course non-compliant because they didn't get an approval for the new medical device, which was a combination of the previous two. And I assume they also maybe got a bit in trouble with the manufacturers themselves. So they kept the code available with a huge number of disclaimers. And they took and they did away with all their responsibility on the actual use. They made some sort of a scientific project out of it. I know this because I was in a room when this was shared. But going beyond this, with the idea that somebody can design its own medical device, yes, it can be done, but nobody would be interested. My wording is a bit strong in that, but nonetheless, if they want to make it available to others, then yes, they need to comply with the regulation. There would be no question about that, and that's given by the device of by the definition of making available in Article 1 and the placing on the market in the same article. Over.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think that you've comprehensively answered this question, regardless of which direction we are taking. I think that this was exactly what was meant by the question. Now, the next one comes from a dear colleague we've been working together with for many years, and she asks, do you see a difference in the spread or level of patient involvement or patient engagement between Europe and the US or North America? And also, what is the current level of patient engagement in medical devices in the industry right now as we speak? So how does it look like now?
I can attempt a light response to start with, to kick the discussion. I am not aware, I don't know how things happen in America, so I can't make a comparison, but what I'm seeing lately, by lately I mean since the date of publication of the MDR, we actively try to involve patient organizations as stakeholders in our work, and maybe the most notable I am aware of, because it was under my scrutiny, was the development of summary of safety and clinical performance document where we had the patient involved. As a matter of fact, I think they contacted us. They got in the game via the clinicians organization, and finally, in the end, they become also official representatives in our working groups, at least in those that I'm working with. So we can definitely see a trend of increased participation of patient in the regulatory work. Now it's implementation regulatory work, and I believe that our participation today is one of the proof. It's a proof for that. So maybe for industry point of view, I'm not so familiar with, but maybe Oliver have some ideas. I'm aware that they have also some programs with patients. Over.
I would agree with Paul. We've seen a definite increase in the activity of patient associations in the implementation of the new framework. If you ask me the challenging question, what is the state of patient involvement by the industry, I will give you the answer that probably it's mixed. Right? You will probably find manufacturers who are making good efforts and using some of the best practices, and several who have a long way to go. I think patients at the end of the day will be the best judges about whether we're in a good shape or on the right track. I would encourage us to keep seeing this as something where best practices should be encouraged of the industry, because as some speakers like Alan have correctly pointed out, the regulations did not go so far as to explicitly require patient involvement. This is not something that is a legal requirement, but it is nevertheless a very legitimate expectation of the patients we serve. So I would encourage patient groups like EUPATI and others to keep flagging to us what a good practice, what a bad practice looks like, so that we know what the expectations are of us and judge us accordingly on what happens.
Right. We have a next one which goes specifically to Inga. So the question is, could you develop or elaborate more on what right representation means from the patient community when it comes to developing new devices? So does this go beyond saying that you have participants from different generations? And what else should the industry take into consideration when partnering with the patient community? How do you see this?
Yeah, thanks for the question. That's actually one that's being often asked also to the ESC and to our patient forum. I mean, the whole question of representativeness of patients is really difficult. I, for myself, would never say I can represent other patients. I can represent myself, my experiences. I can probably pass on what I've heard from other patients, what I've heard from support groups, etc. But representativeness is really difficult, and I can say in our patient forum in the ESC, we have decided to not say that one person can really speak for all and represent all. But still, of course, in projects and in like developing medical devices or medications, if you involve patients, I would say, yeah, you have to make sure that you get a broad range of patients with different backgrounds, also educational backgrounds, because you cannot only go with the real patient experts, because these are not, it's a bad word, but the typical patients. So you need to try to really get a broad range of patients, probably also involve caregivers, because not all patients are fit enough or in the position to really advocate for themselves. This would be important to look also into the caregivers, to look into different ages, different backgrounds. In our forum, there's currently a big question about different ethnical backgrounds. I mean, this is a hot topic at the moment everywhere, and so it's difficult, but it's also important to have several patients involved, because for the patients themselves, and I feel like that, I'm happy that Veerle is here in this panel, so we can support each other. This is also important to keep in mind. If you invite only one patient, this puts the patient in quite a difficult position. Yeah, so this will be my take. Maybe Veerle has a different perspective from her experience.
Yes, especially because the next question also goes to Veerle. So Veerle, come back, please. And I agree. I mean, one of our objectives has been also with this session to create or to kickstart kind of a cooperation across stakeholders, which includes cooperation amongst patients as well. Veerle, if you turn on your camera, then I can also take a quick group picture of all of us before Oliver has to go.
I think she's offline. She seems to be having a connection issue, so I would move on.
Okay,
to the next
good.
question.
So we move on to the next question. So the next question is about smart companies investing in smart data pipelines. And pharmaceutical companies need to create data pipelines as well as drug pipelines. Do you agree with this? Is that relevant for what you do in this field? Because we're really not in about pharmaceutical development here, but maybe it's still relevant for you.
Tamás, are you able to tell me what a smart data pipeline is? I'm not familiar with the term personally.
I don't know, but actually I think that a smart data pipeline is when you have a long-term big data work plan and try to design your pharmaceutical development according to insights that you gain from data that you collect from clinical trials, but also from phase 4 studies and pharmacovigilance. But maybe this is not a relevant question for us, and then we can just move on.
I'm not personally familiar enough with the concepts to comment. Okay. Apologies.
So let's see the next one, which is how many patients would you consider to be a reliable source when you say that you listen to the patient voice? It's difficult to define, writes the audience, what is a common patient opinion, or is it just a patient's personal opinion? So what would be a representative sample for you, if it can be defined at all?
Can I make a comment, perhaps?
Of course you can.
I think that's a very interesting question, and one for which there is no simple answer. I think one patient can be extremely useful if they have a very original or new insight that the clinicians, the doctors, and the manufacturer have not considered. And I know of some examples where that has happened. Otherwise, I think the way we are going now with monitoring of device performance is that for high-risk devices, we're developing comprehensive registries where every patient will be included. And then how many patients are available, hopefully, will be virtually everyone. And that means that a lot of data will be available quickly and will be very useful for the assessment of the efficacy and safety of new devices in future. So I think we will find before long that any patient with a high-risk implanted device will be asked to give permission for their data to be included in registries. And then the question really doesn't arise because it's everyone. In the meantime, what is sufficient evidence for it to be reliable is an interesting academic question for which we don't yet have an answer, but some of us are proposing to consider that and to try to work out what would be an appropriate level. But it would be many hundreds before you start to say this is the average view. The issue may be here that the patients who report their experience are those who've had problems, and to get a reliable overview, you need a big sample. Thank you.
If I may try to continue, Paul, here, I think the reply depends on what exactly is the intention of the question. Because if we're talking about a safety signal, the PIP case, the breast implant case, was flagged by one surgeon who had quite a limited number of patients, and that was of major impact, both in tragedy terms and in regulatory terms. Then, if you want to extract clinical data, for instance, as Professor Fraser explained, you can also, especially as a manufacturer, gather this data based on, for instance, reported patient outcomes, which is something that we are trying to develop right now, and we hope to have in a few years active. This would be relevant for cases like surgical meshes, for instance. But if you're talking, if the question refers rather in terms of regulatory input, I will admit that at EU level, at least, we are more superficial, and we accept to discuss. I would again use a bit of funny language with EU-wide patient organization. So it'd be very difficult at the EU level to talk with individual patients. We do sometimes, and we take those signals in account when they occur, of course. But to make sense in terms of, or to really be representative in terms of regulatory impact, I think EU-wide organizations are for us at least the type of mass in terms of input that we would need. I hope this really helps. And how a manufacturer takes into account the input from the patient, I think this is specific to company, and maybe Oliver can complement on that.
Thank you, Paul. Maybe I need to leave in a few minutes, so why don't I say I think this really is a case-by-case situation, not least because the medical technology sector is extraordinarily diverse in terms of the range of products. I mean, unlike pharmaceuticals, which by and large are chemical molecules that you just bring into the body to see if they work or not and whether they work safely or not. You can standardize a little bit how you investigate that and patient acceptance of that. But when you're dealing with technologies which range from invasive implants to devices that are in contact with the patient for just a few minutes, or devices that don't touch the patient at all, or which are in the form of software, you know, the extent to which you need to study it with a large number or smaller number of patients, the extent to which you need to involve patients in that process, it can vary enormously. So while that sounds like a cop-out from the question, what I would say is that the regulations are deliberately structured such that the manufacturer must make the case to its notified body about what the acceptable level of involvement is, and be judged accordingly, depending on the amount of evidence they put on the table, the extent of their claims, and so forth. So it is left a little bit to the specificities of the situation and the technology, but we tend to think that's the right way to go. I think the sector is too diverse to have a one-size-fits-all approach.
All right. Thank you, Oliver. Before you go, I would like to take a group picture of all of you. Just smile. All you need to do is you have to smile happily. Okay, I've taken a couple of pictures of you. Thank you very much. That's for our internal communications work. And Oliver, log off whenever you need to. And thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you so much. Great event. Thank you.
Thank you. It was really exciting. We have a question for you, Veerle, which was raised while you were away, which is that, which says, here is it. Where is it? It is here. So how would you like to see manufacturers work with patients and the public? And do you have any thoughts on how manufacturers can best connect with patients in order to get input on products during the development stage? So what would be the ideal situation for you?
The ideal situation, I mean, I come across some people from industry on various events, and I've got quite a number of cards, and I've been trying to get in touch, but it's very hard because a lot of them don't respond. So I think a response to mail would already be good. And I think, I mean, we're at a stage where the patient involvement in medicine development was about 10 years ago. I mean, we're starting to get there. It just, yeah, I think they have to, within companies, they have to regulate it within the company themselves to be allowed to talk to patients. But as Oliver put rightly, I mean, it's such a broad area. It's such a broad area of products. I mean, it's so diverse, so it's hard to kind of regulate and put in place in every company. But I think it's already, I mean, it's a good start that EUPATI sat together with MedTech last year, and they're starting to talk, and we'll have hopefully item on medical device in the toolbox as well. So we're at the start, I think, of a change in how the things are being done. I'm very happy with it. And apologies for I was thrown out of the session, so I had to quickly reconnect, but happy to be on it as well. And I was happy to hear. Yeah. So and I was happy with that. Well,
another question is, or Inga, did you want to say something? I'm sorry, maybe I spoke over you.
I just wanted to add something to what Veerle just said, because I also believe that there is legislation in place that kind of prohibits manufacturers or pharmaceutical industry to directly get in touch with patients. And of course, everybody understands this is more to protect the patients also. But sometimes it makes it really difficult to interact with the industry, I would say. And sometimes this is probably a bit too protective, because then you always have to go through the patient organizations and patients who are not affiliated with any organization don't get a chance to really interact with the industry. So while it's good on the one side to have this protection, it also makes it more difficult to interact.
Well, for that, I think it's important to know, especially now that we are having the Patient Engagement Open Forum, that there are guidelines coming out from Paradigm, co-organizer of this very event as well, which discusses this very situation, what happens if you want to involve patients who are not affiliated with the patient organization. So I suggest that as soon as these guidelines come out, which is in a matter of weeks, that you study them. There's an open or a public consultation about these particular documents going on right now. So you can also make your voices heard, reading through these documents and make an input. But that's exactly a situation that we try to discuss, which also refers to one of, or is related to one of the other questions that came through in the questions and answers box, which is, would you agree that patients, in this case, also includes caregivers, informal or formal caregivers? How do you see that? Is that relevant?
Yes, I think any feedback on experience with medical devices is valuable, whether it comes from the patient themselves, if they still are able to, or their caregivers who also have that experience of living with a person with a device. I think that's equally valuable. Yes.
Okay, that's actually also the general EUPATI approach, that caregivers are part of this group. Inga?
No, I totally echo what Veerle said. They should be and need to be part of the group because of various reasons, as Veerle said. Sometimes the patients themselves cannot, speak for themselves, and also, I mean, the caregivers by giving care to their loved ones, they have their own experiences that they might bring in. They see also technology that might not be working, that they have at home that is not working for them the way they would like it to work. So this can be really of additional value to have the caregivers.
Yes. And I only want to come back to one point. I think it was Dr. Fraser talking about that it's only the negative feedback of patients that is often being listened to, but I would like to contradict that because, I mean, that's not always the case. I'm still very happy with my device. So,
yeah, but
I'm briefly, Veerle, I'm very happy to hear that, and I don't think I was implying that only negative comments are listened to or indeed collected, but they're the ones that may motivate many people to get involved if they feel there's been a concern, and that's completely legitimate and actually very helpful sometimes. But I would fully support you that feedback across the whole range of devices, where they work and where they don't, and how they benefit, and where there may be things that can be improved, is completely valuable for all the people involved in the process of developing devices and bringing them to the market. Agree with that.
Okay, thank you.
It's probably not true that you only get this negative feedback, but what I do see clearly, and I've been in patient online support groups for more than 20 years, what I do see clearly is that those that really take the step to engage usually do it because they had some kind of negative experience, and this drives them to advocate. But it's then that they turn, as you said, whether you turn this negative experience into something good, into something helpful and constructive. And this is the important point, that you move a bit away from your own negative experience. You take a step back and you turn it into a constructive feedback. And this is what happens through patient organizations and also in the forums.
I agree, Inga.
Yeah. If I may have a short intervention, I was ruminating on the fact that the legislation always talks about and looks after the negative bits and the problems and the safety signals and so on. But then I realized I was wrong, because a medical device is only placed on the market if it has a positive benefit risk profile. So in the third bit, you of course collect all the positive outcomes of the use of the medical devices. So both participations of clinicians and patients are very important for determining what can go wrong, what is going wrong with medical devices, but also what is going right. So that was my intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, we are a little bit over time. So with this, I will need to wrap up this session, and thank you very much for your contributions. I'm supposed to make a summary, but it's a little difficult because actually I find that Alan's summary with this particular slide that I left on screen says it all. Especially if we consider the need, but also the benefits of patient engagement, also in the field of medical devices. Once again, I would like to thank you all for participating. Also, I would like to thank the attendees also for your questions. If we could not answer everything, then please send an email to me. I'm very easy to find, and I will try to make sure that any additional questions are answered. Please also join our next session, which will be about access and affordability of medicines from a patient perspective. Might also be very exciting. And the recording and the slides of this session will be available in a lightly edited form on our websites. So thank you very much. And with this, we say goodbye and have a nice afternoon. Goodbye.